In the 1970s, American farming was infected with a dangerous idea. Everyone believed that debt was the only way to build a successful future. Arrogant salesmen stood in shiny showrooms and told hard-working men that their paid-off iron was worthless junk. They pushed brand new tractors with enclosed cabs and massive price tags, promising that the good times would never end. In one small farming town, a young man named Jesse Hadfield refused to listen. When the most powerful equipment dealer in the county publicly humiliated him for driving an old rusted tractor and refusing to sign a loan, Jesse simply walked away. The entire town laughed at his stubbornness. But exactly 1 decade later, the laughter completely stopped. When the most brutal financial crisis in agricultural history swept across the Midwest, that mocked decision made Jesse the very last man standing while the arrogant salesman lost absolutely everything. Let me set the scene, because understanding the temptation of the 1970s is the only way to understand why Jesse made his choice. In 1976, Jesse Hadfield was just 19 years old when he took over his family's 320-acre farm in McLean County, Illinois. His father had suddenly passed away, leaving the young man with a modest farming operation, a wooden machine shed full of worn hand tools, and exactly zero debt. The absolute pride of the Hadfield farm was a 1959 Massey Ferguson tractor. It was a rugged machine with faded red paint, a badly dented hood, and a heavy diesel engine that always smoked a little bit on cold October mornings. But to Jesse, that machine was absolutely beautiful for one very specific reason. His father had paid cash for it and owned every single piece of iron from the front tires to the rear drawbar. The problem was that 1976 was a terrible time to be a cautious farmer in the Midwest. The international export markets were completely booming, and grain prices were skyrocketing to record highs. Suddenly, every farmer in central Illinois felt invincible. The local banks were practically begging men to borrow money to expand their operations, and the equipment dealers were having the absolute time of their lives. The most successful dealer in the entire county was a man named Carl Brandt. Carl sold brand new tractors, and he wore a heavy gold watch that cost more than Jess's everyday pickup truck. Carl firmly believed that any farmer who was not financing modern equipment was a fool who was actively throwing away his future. He spent his days driving from farm to farm, convincing cautious men to trade in their reliable paid-off machines for massive new tractors, wrapped in heavy 5-year loans at 12% interest. Carl Brandt looked at a young, grieving kid like Jesse Hadfield and saw an incredibly easy target. He saw a boy trying to run a major farming operation with a 17-year-old machine that most people thought belonged in a scrapyard. Everywhere Jesse went in town, he saw his neighbors driving brand new machines with enclosed air-conditioned cabs and perfectly clean paint. The social pressure to conform, the pressure to walk into Carl's shiny glass dealership and sign his name on a piece of paper for a brand new tractor was immense. It was the modern American dream, wrapped in shiny paint and heavy banking debt. But Jesse had made a quiet, steadfast promise to his late father. He promised that he would never, ever let a bank own a single piece of his livelihood. He spent his evenings alone in his dirt floor shed, carefully maintaining his old Massey Ferguson, replacing worn belts and greasing fittings by the light of a single bulb. Meanwhile, his neighbors sat in their new cabs and proudly bragged about their massive expansion plans. Jesse was completely alone in his conservative philosophy, but he was about to find out just how expensive the modern alternative really was. Let me tell you about the moment it became personal, because that specific morning changed the way the entire town looked at the young farmer. It was a Sunday morning in October of 1976. Jesse Hadfield drove his faded pickup truck into town to visit the local feed and supply store. He needed to buy some hydraulic fluid and a few heavy-duty replacement belts to keep his old Massey Ferguson combine running through the tough harvest. In this tight-knit community, the local supply store was the absolute center of the universe. It was the place where every important conversation happened and where reputations were built or completely destroyed. When Jesse walked through the front door, the loud chatter in the room suddenly stopped. Carl Brandt, the wealthy equipment dealer, was standing by the coffee counter surrounded by half a dozen older farmers. Carl was wearing a perfectly pressed shirt, and his heavy gold watch caught the overhead light. He had been boasting about the massive loans he had written that week for brand new equipment. Carl looked at Jesse, and then he looked down at the worn-out belts the young man was holding in his grease-stained hands. Carl smiled, a wide, arrogant smile that made the other farmers turn and watch. Carl asked Jesse how the harvest was going with that rusted-out piece of museum equipment. Before Jesse could even answer, Carl announced to the entire room that the old Massey Ferguson was nothing but worthless scrap metal. He loudly proclaimed that the antique machine was going to permanently break down in the middle of the season and leave Jesse's entire crop to rot in the mud. Carl stepped closer, invading the young man's personal space. He shifted his tone to sound like a concerned father, but the words were dripping with pure condescension. He told Jesse that he had a brand new shiny machine sitting on his dealership lot right now. Carl aggressively pressured him, offering to write up a 5-year loan at 12% interest. He promised that signing that debt was the absolute only way Jesse would ever survive as a real farmer. The room went completely silent, waiting to see how the young kid would handle the immense pressure. Jesse did not look at the floor, and he did not back away. He looked directly into the eyes of the most powerful man in the county. Jesse spoke quietly, but with absolute iron certainty. He told Carl that his father had financed a new machine just a few years earlier. He explained that the crushing stress of that bank debt was the exact thing that had destroyed his father's health and sent him to an early grave. Jesse declared perfectly clearly that he would never finance a single piece of equipment from Carl or from anyone else as long as he lived. For a moment, Carl stared at him in pure shock. Then the arrogant dealer let out a loud, booming laugh that filled the entire store. The other farmers quickly joined in, chuckling and shaking their heads at the absolute foolishness of a 19-year-old kid. They treated his solemn vow to stay debt-free like a hilarious joke. Jesse simply paid for his belts, walked out to his truck, and drove back to his dirt floor shed while the cruel laughter of his own neighbors echoed behind him. Now, let me tell you about 1982, because that is the year the music completely stopped for American agriculture. The good times that Carl Brandt promised would last forever suddenly vanished overnight. The federal government raised interest rates to combat inflation, and the results in the Midwest were absolutely devastating. Operating loans that had been written at 9% were suddenly renewing at 18 and even 20%. At the exact same time, the international export markets collapsed, causing the price of corn and soybeans to fall through the absolute floor. Land values, which were the core collateral holding up every single farm loan in the country, began to plummet. The farmers who had laughed at Jesse Hadfield, the men who had eagerly signed 5-year loans for brand new machines with air-conditioned cabs were suddenly trapped in an inescapable financial nightmare. The farm crisis swept through McLean County like a slow-moving plague. Every single week, another foreclosure notice appeared on a local mailbox. The community banks were forced to call in loans, and the proud men who had loudly bragged about their massive expansion plans were suddenly losing land that had been in their families for 3 generations. But the most dramatic downfall belonged to Carl Brandt and his shiny equipment dealership. During the boom years, Carl had sold hundreds of massive tractors on easy credit, convincing everyone that debt was the only logical path to farming success. But when the brutal crisis hit, the farmers who could not pay their local bankers certainly could not pay their equipment dealer. New tractor sales completely evaporated. In 1979, Carl sold 40 new units, but by 1983, he sold exactly 0. Instead of selling gleaming new machines out of his showroom, Carl was forced to spend his days driving across the county repossessing equipment from his own loyal customers. He had to look his lifelong friends in the eye and hook tow chains to the expensive tractors he had aggressively pressured them to buy. By 1984, Carl's massive dealership lot was a depressing graveyard of repossessed iron. He had dozens of practically new machines sitting in the tall grass that absolutely nobody could afford to buy. The regional bank that had financed Carl's massive commercial inventory was now breathing down his own neck, demanding massive monthly payments that he simply could not make. The wealthy, arrogant salesman who had worn a heavy gold watch and publicly shamed a 19-year-old kid for staying out of debt was now drowning in the exact same toxic financial system he had helped create. His immense pride was entirely gone, replaced by the crushing daily stress of impending bankruptcy, while his former customers openly blamed him for their total financial ruin. While his neighbors lost everything, Jesse Hadfield quietly survived. The 1980s farm crisis hit McLean County with brutal force. Interest rates climbed into the mid-teens, and corn prices fell far below production costs. Land values dropped by 40% almost overnight. Farmers who followed the advice to get bigger and borrow more watched their equity completely evaporate. Between 1982 and 1986, 11 farms within 10 miles of the Hadfield property went to foreclosure auctions. Jesse went to some of those sales, standing in the back, watching men he had known his entire life sell their land and machinery, but Jesse never came close to losing his farm. His operating costs were incredibly low. He had no land payments, minimal overhead, and absolutely no massive equipment loans to service. He easily survived selling corn at $2 a bushel when his heavily indebted neighbors needed $3.50 just to break even. The old Massey Ferguson machine that Carl had so publicly mocked kept harvesting year after year. Jesse patiently rebuilt it and paid for every replacement part in cash. The ultimate vindication did not happen in a shiny showroom, but in the quiet basement of a local Methodist church. In the early spring of 1989, Jesse's grandfather passed away. After the solemn service, Carl Brandt slowly walked up to Jesse. Carl was 62 years old and looked completely exhausted. The heavy gold watch that used to catch the light was gone, sold off to keep his struggling business afloat. His once dominant dealership had barely survived the crushing economic crisis. Carl looked directly at the young man he had tried to humiliate 13 years earlier. He spoke quietly, telling Jesse that he needed to say something he should have said a long time ago. Carl brought up that Sunday morning at the supply store when he pressured Jesse to sign a 5-year loan. He admitted right there in front of the surrounding mourners that he had been completely wrong about everything. He confessed that Jesse had proven the traditional way still worked and that a man could farm without suffocating debt. Carl's voice was heavy with deep regret as he explained that he had spent 20 years telling hard-working farmers the exact opposite and watched half of them go under for believing his arrogant sales pitch. Jesse looked at the defeated dealer for a long time. He did not gloat or demand any further apologies. He simply extended his hand and shook Carl's hand firmly. Jesse quietly told Carl that the blame belonged to the entire greedy system that pushed massive debt as the only path forward. Carl nodded with red eyes, admitting that Jesse had been the smartest man in the county. The powerful salesman had finally learned the hardest lesson of his life from the boy he had once treated as a complete fool.
Let me ask you something and take your time with this one. When does a piece of equipment truly belong to you? The modern world and those arrogant salesmen always want you to believe that success is measured by having the newest, the biggest, and the shiniest machinery on the field. They sell you convenience and comfort, but what they are actually taking away is your absolute freedom. Debt is exactly like a heavy gold chain. It might look incredibly impressive to the neighbors, but it is still a chain around your neck. Jesse Hadfield's old Massey Ferguson might have been rusted, it might have lacked air conditioning, and it was certainly loud. But it possessed one invisible feature that absolutely no brand new tractor on Carl Brandt's dealership lot could ever offer. It belonged to the young farmer 100%. When the brutal economic storms finally hit and the interest rates climbed into the sky, the last man standing was not the one with the most expensive equipment. The survivor was the man who owed absolutely nothing to anyone. Now, before we finish, I want to share a small secret with you. While the careful genius and the stubborn spirit of this tale beat in the heart of every rural American town, the specific names and events like Jesse and his perfectly maintained old combine are a carefully crafted legend. It is a fictional tribute dedicated to the countless quiet farmers across this country who refuse to be suffocated by massive debt and build their own salvation from paid-off iron. If you believe in the undeniable genius of the conservative American farmer and the absolute value of old iron, please hit that like button and subscribe to the Farm Legacy. Go down to the comments right now and tell me if you have ever chosen to keep an old, reliable piece of equipment instead of taking on heavy debt for something brand new. Until next time, always remember that true freedom on a farm begins the exact moment you pay cash for your tools.